Hi, this is Mr. Dreyer coming to you from Menchville High School with another AP government lesson. Today we're looking at Unit 2, specifically the powers of Congress. Today I'm going to talk about something called Congressional Oversight. Congressional oversight are basically ways that Congress can stop the power of other branches of government. And if you wanted to follow along, this is also on page 181 of the book, which is American Government, O'Connor, Sabato, and Yanis. So we know that there's checks and balances and separation of powers inside of the federal government. These are things that we talked about. There's sort of the entire idea of the federal government. And let's go over a few of these ideas. Number one, there is something called the War Powers Resolution. The War Powers Resolution was passed in the 1970s. And this is an attempt to try to limit the power of the president to be able to send troops into battle overseas. Now remember, in the Constitution, the president is commander-in-chief, and the president has the ability in the Constitution to send troops into conflicts. However, the Vietnam War sort of left a bad taste in many people's mouths, and some people felt that the president had too much power. So this War Powers Resolution was passed in 1973. The War Powers Resolution lays out a few conditions the president has to follow. So A, the president has to notify Congress within 48 hours of sending troops overseas. B, within 60 days, Congress has to vote or authorize those troops to remain overseas, otherwise they can be called back. Theoretically, the president should notify Congress as soon as possible when he sends troops overseas. So the real question is, has this really worked to reduce the power of the president? And the real answer is no. Ever since the 1970s, technology has increased, and now a lot of actions the president can take in terms of the military last a day or a week or are very short. So for instance, the president can order a drone strike on a terrorist base. He can order a drone strike on an Iranian general or something like that, and that literally takes minutes or hours to do. And so in that case, Congress really has no oversight of that at all. The second thing is presidents have just chosen to ignore the War Powers Resolution because really, what can Congress do? So most presidents since the 1970s have actually said that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional because the War Powers Resolution, sorry, that was bothering me, because the War Powers Resolution is not in the Constitution, it's not an amendment to the Constitution, and it takes away power that the president should rightly have. So this really hasn't had a lot of effect. And plus, we haven't fought a lot of really long wars since that time. A couple of exceptions, maybe being our involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay. Now keep in mind, if I wanted to make a little chart here, this would be Congress's power to exercise oversight on the executive branch. And I also wanted to point out one thing. I've seen many students fall into this trap. There'll be a question on the AP test or a question in FRQ that I give in class. It'll say, list some ways that Congress can check the power of the president or the executive branch in the Constitution. And they will talk about the War Powers Resolution, and everything they write down will be correct, except the fact that the War Powers Resolution isn't in the Constitution. And so they will miss the entire FRQ. So my point is, read the FRQ closely. If it says in the original Constitution, the only thing you can really talk about is Congress can override a veto of the president, or they can impeach the president, or they can deny the president funding. So those are things that are specifically in the Constitution, not the War Powers Resolution. Okay, the second thing, and this is going on to page 181, is congressional review. Congressional review is yet again an act or a law passed by Congress. And here's the major idea. We haven't talked about this, but the executive branch is not just the president and some of the president's advisors. It's also this very large federal bureaucracy that has many departments and millions of employees. And these departments can pass things called regulations, which really have the force of law. Probably the best example of these regulations are things passed by the EPA, which are the Environmental Protection Agency. But there are many other examples. So some people are like, well, how can those have the force of laws if they're not actually passed by Congress? We're going to go over this later, but Congress made these agencies to begin with, and they gave them authority to make laws in these areas. So that's why, in some ways, the bureaucracy can make these regulations. It's called the rulemaking process, and they make regulations that have the power of law. So if the EPA makes some regulation about using pesticides or some chemical, it does have the force of law. Well, some people felt that this gave the federal bureaucracy too much power because they are suddenly making laws, which should actually be the power of the legislative branch, not the executive branch. And so that's why this rulemaking, our Congressional Review Act, was passed to begin with in 1996. And what this says is within 60 days of some regulation being implemented, being approved by a part of the federal bureaucracy, Congress can review it and they can actually nullify it. Now, in practice, this has been used almost never. It had been used like one time up until Trump became president in 2016. And within Trump's first few months of his presidency, when the Congress was predominantly Republican, they went back and looked at a bunch of regulations that were passed in the last year of Obama's presidency, and they nullified some of them, or they reviewed them and voted against them. Now, keep in mind, congressional review is not just Congress. It's sort of like Congress and the president, kind of like passing a law. So Congress has to agree to nullify the act, the regulation, and the president has to sign off on it. And when it says 60 days, it says 60 sort of like congressional working days. So in practice, this could actually be many months rather than just 2 months. So some of these regulations could have been passed almost nearly a year before the new Congress takes office, and they can nullify them or get rid of them. So yet again, this column, the War Powers Resolution, is a check on the executive branch, whereas congressional review is more of a check on the federal bureaucracy, which also is the executive branch, but I'm just trying to be specific here. Okay, going on down, there's confirmation of presidential appointees. So the power to confirm. Now, the power to confirm is something that only the Senate has. So yet again, we need to know that the Senate has some powers that the House of Representatives does not. And what this means is the president has the power to appoint. It's called the appointment power, a lot of his aides, and also the people in charge of the federal bureaucracy, some people in the military, and also federal judges. There's a huge list of the people the president can confirm. Normally, we only talk about his power to appoint Supreme Court justices, but he has the power to appoint many other people. However, the Senate must review those appointments and agree. Half the Senate has to agree, meaning confirm the appointment of the president. And this is sort of a check on the president's power. The last, maybe not the last thing, I guess maybe the last thing is impeachment. Impeachment, obviously, is something in the Constitution. And impeachment is something where half of the House of Representatives could file articles of impeachment, but then it goes to the Senate, where the Senate votes on the impeachment. And we have to keep in mind that 2/3 of the senators would have to agree to impeach somebody. And that's a pretty high number. Yet again, this is a check on the power of the executive. Keep in mind that Congress can also impeach Supreme Court justices or federal judges. So you could say, if there's a question on an AP test, that this is also a check on the power of the judicial branch. So in a nutshell, all of these things are called congressional oversight. I don't know why I put Congress oversight. And normally I've seen questions where it will say, talk about two ways Congress can conduct oversight of the executive branch, or two ways that Congress conducts oversight. And then you would have to list a few of these things. Here are some common mistakes. I've noticed that a lot of students have trouble getting congressional review and congressional oversight straight. Sometimes they confuse those because they do sound similar. Congressional oversight is the big category that we're talking about, whereas congressional review is just one of these examples, and this deals specifically with the federal bureaucracy and regulations and the rulemaking process. So don't make that mistake. Okay, that was a very brief lesson on congressional oversight, and I will talk to you again sometime soon.